Hey folks, we're back again. This time we have Simon Woolley, editor extraordinaire, the man that launched Retro Cars magazine, for which we are forever grateful. Currently editor of Classic Ford and a contributor to Speed Hunters in the past as well. He is a very knowledgeable, very well experienced chap within the world of magazines, and he is also a great friend of Retro Rides, and we love him dearly. So welcome, Simon.
Thank you. Hello.
How are you today?
I'm good, actually. I've had 6 espressos, so I'm raring to go.
Absolutely buzzing. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to start with our first question of why cars? Why do you like cars?
I have to pin that squarely on my dad, I'm afraid. Like quite a lot of people, when I was a kid, me and my brother, we were obsessed because he always had interesting cars. Either as stuff in the garage or the cars he used to just drive to work in or drive us to school or on holiday. So whatever tap BL were putting out in the 70s, generally my dad had an example of it. And so that's where it all started.
That's great. That's great. Anything particularly stand out from the BL tat that your dad had?
He had about 3, maybe 4 SD1 Rovers in a go. I think he started off with the 2-litre and hated it. And then he obviously got a V8. Then he got a Vanden Plas, and we just thought they were supercars. They were just nothing else like he'd had before. So I think out of all of them, those particularly stand out. I mean, I remember driving down to Spain in one of them. I can't imagine how much that must have cost in fuel at the time. But yeah, it was always an adventure because you knew you were in something a little bit better than a lot of the rubbish that was around at the time, even though it probably wasn't particularly well built. But I don't remember everything breaking down. I mean, he had a black SD1 V8 for a while, but he literally had it for weeks because for whatever reason, I can't remember why now, it came without any power steering, and he absolutely hated it. And we used to live in this tiny cottage with a really narrow gateway into the sort of the drive in front of the house, and every night coming home from work you could hear him outside swearing, trying to get the car into this space, heaving on this steering wheel. But he had Dolomite Springs, he had 2.5 Triumphs, then he got into E28 BMWs when sort of very early 80s, when they were probably about as cheap as you could get them. He had a Series 1 E-Type for a while that he did a few bits on, and obviously it was only a 2-seater, but me and my brother were quite happy just lying down in the back on the sort of boot boards, and we'd go everywhere in that car. That was amazing. To have that then in this sort of, silly little market town in the middle of nowhere, it just felt like something else.
Yeah, I should imagine you felt kings of the world in that. That's amazing.
Yeah, I'm sure my mum to this day still despairs because obviously both my brother and I ended up working in the sort of car industry in various different ways, and so I'm sure she had these dreams of us doing something else completely. But yeah, I think from sort of, when you're sort of 8 or 9 and you're such an impressionable age, I don't think you've got any choice really at that point. You just end up predestined to do what was into at that point.
Yeah.
It's like, and his one of his sons, Tom Ravenscroft's obviously a really big DJ now. I mean, he's obsessed with new music. I think he's just, that's because that's what his dad did, and that's what you end up doing.
Yeah, I think you're right. You end up, there's an inflection point, I think, where either you reject everything or that's what it becomes. I think that's probably a reasonably good bet around, as you say, around 8 years old, and you're somewhat set in terms of your interests and hobbies. So what's your own personal car history? What was your first car?
When I was about 14 onwards, I became obsessed with motorbikes. I mean, this was sort of early 80s, and so all the 2-stroke Yamahas were big then, like the RD 350s and 250s, and I just thought they were something else. And so I was always going to go down the road of getting a bike, and I'd have posters on my wall of power valve Yamahas, and that's what I wanted to do. But my dad, he like a lot of young people in the sort of 50s and 60s. He had loads of motorbikes, and he also had loads of accidents. And so every time the subject was raised, he would like raise a trouser leg to show me like one of his 8-inch scars from where he'd fallen off, or he's got a particularly bad one on his stomach where he came off. So yeah, he always pushed me away from that, and he used to tell me that, oh, you should get a Mini because it's like a motorbike but on 4 wheels. They're like go-karts, and I stupidly believed him. So my first car was a Mini, and I ended up having 3 or 4 of them in a row because I just got really into them, and they were so cheap. You could buy one for 10 quid. I mean, it didn't last very long, but you just got rid of it and bought another one. They were just ridiculous. So yeah, I had a couple of saloons, and then I got into the estates because I read somewhere that they handled slightly better. So I had a Mark II Woody Traveller, and then I got a Mark I, an all-steel one without the wood, which was, even back then, was fairly rare. So
that's unusual, yeah.
Yeah, but they were great because although they were horrendous for rust, they were so easy to work on, and that's where I sort of cut my teeth in pulling cars apart. And I got really into tuning up the A-series engines because I bought David Vizard's book.
I was going to say, did you have David Vizard's tuning the A-series engine book?
Yeah, I must bore people stupid because even today I still talk about that book because it was just such an eye-opener. I'd never read anything where someone had gone into so much detail into every single aspect of an engine, and I would just quite happily sit. But back then, when you could, just sit in the evening and read this book and try and absorb all this information, because he just went through absolutely everything, and it was just so clear that you couldn't help but not get drawn into it. And because all the stuff was so cheap back then, if you tried something and it didn't work, you just buy another one and start again. So yeah, that was really good. And for quite a while I wanted to be an engineer. I was just thinking, yeah, this is what I want to do, but I've always struggled with maths, and I tried to do it at college, went for an interview and failed miserably. So I thought I need to go and do something else instead.
Well, that actually segues beautifully into how you kind of ended up working in magazines. So going from wanting to be an engineer, finding out it wasn't for you for various reasons. So how did you end up working in the magazine industry?
That was that was kind of by accident. The 3 things I've always been really passionate about: cars, magazines, and music. And particularly when I was a teenager, I was just, music was one of the things in my life that I just lived for more than anything. And so I became quite obsessed with record sleeves. I mean, this is the era when factory records were big, and so Peter Saville was doing these amazing sort of creations for bands like New Order and A Certain Ratio, and every single one was different, and they always had a concept. And so if you went out on a Saturday and bought a 12-inch or an LP, if you had enough money, you come home and you just, as well as getting into the music, you just be absorbed into this world of design. And so for quite a long time I wanted to be a record sleeve designer, and I went to college. I did a foundation course, and then went off to do an H&D down in Taunton, which funnily enough is where I first met Bryn Musselwhite and also Bruce Holder. So yeah, so that was my plan. And then the CD age came along, and I was like, I don't want to do this. These are rubbish. How can you create this amazing visual concept in on a bit of plastic with a sleeve inside that's 12 centimeters square? And I became a bit disheartened. And this course, in particular H&D course, it was brutal. I mean, it really weeded out the ones that were set to do stuff and those that were just going to sort of bumble along. And after a year of that, I thought, I can't do this. I'm just going to end up designing Argos catalogues for the rest of my life. No disrespect to people that do that for a living, but I just couldn't see myself doing it. So I left the course, and then ended up working in a record shop for a year, working out what I wanted to do. And back then, this is pre you having to pay for your tuition fees. I worked out that I still had 3 years worth of funding available from the council for a course. I thought, right, I'm going to do a degree. I don't care what it is, but I just need to do something because I don't want to work in this shop for another 5 years, even though I quite enjoyed it. So I went off to do a film studies course because I was quite into film as well. And yeah, again, nothing relevant at all, but it sort of sowed a seed, I guess, because I came out and I finished the course, didn't know what to do, and whilst I was on holiday, I saw an advert in the Guardian for a sub-editor, junior writer on Mini Magazine, which was then published by A&S Publishing in Gloucester, which I wasn't living anywhere near at the time. And obviously had the Mini connection still, so I applied for that and got the job, and that sort of started it all off, really. And again, that was a real trial by fire, because I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know anything about magazine craft, even though I was obsessed with magazines. But it was really intensive, but I learned a lot, especially in that first year. And the then production manager, she was she was fairly brutal, so you had to learn very quickly, which was grim at the time, but in hindsight has done me a world of favors, because you just, when you need to turn stuff out and turn it around quickly, you can just do it now. So that was good. So I got into that very quickly, and the whole sort of idea of magazine craft really grabbed me as well. And so really, I was doing 2 out of my 3 passions as a job. So I landed on my feet. I was
not doing too bad.
Yeah, I mean, the money was dreadful, but it didn't matter back then, because I didn't have a mortgage, and so you sort of found a way to live. So it was fine.
Yeah, definitely. It's I think that's one of those things with those early career jobs, particularly actually in the era that you were doing them, that you could kind of scrape by on what you were getting. I think nowadays it's slightly changed in that a lot of those things tend to be kind of almost free. You have to be willing to work for free for a while, which kind of sucked. But back, I guess, what would this have been, sort of early 90s or late 90s?
First proper job was 1996, October 96. I started at A&S. So yeah,
you could sort of get on by the time the turn of the millennium came around. It was a little bit harder to get those entry level jobs, so it was good for an entry level, which is nice. So you worked on Minimag, and you stayed on that, or did you end up moving around, or what is your path then? Because when I first met you was in 2004. And we'll talk about the origin of Retro Cars Magazine, but at that point you were the editor of Retro Cars Magazine. So you've gone from, in that sort of 10-year period, from literal entry level, that really know what you're doing, but very enthusiastic and getting taught, to editing your own magazines. How did that path come around? How did you get through that?
It was luck again. I've been doing Mini Magazine for a year, and Classic Ford magazine, which was also published by them, that had been going for about a year at the time, and that grew out of another magazine called Ford Heritage, which again grew out of Fast Ford magazine, which it's been running for donkey's years. And so Classic Ford was a little bit different, because it was starting to tap into this whole idea of modifying classic cars. And the then editor, a guy called Ian Eyre, it was a bi-monthly, and he just couldn't commit the time to doing the magazine was doing reasonably well, and they thought, right, we can make this a monthly title, but he wasn't able to commit to that. And so this position came available, and they said, well, do you want to do it? And I'm like, yeah.
Okay.
So I was thrown in at the deep end, because although I'd sort of grown up around all these cars and mucking around with minis, I had mates with Mark I Fiestas and Mark II Escorts, and so I was more than au fait with them. But at that point, the sort of nitty gritty of picking apart the differences of a Mark I Escort Mexico to a GT were just beyond me. But I said, yeah, I'm doing this. So that was kind of the beginning of the sort of regeneration of those cars, because they've been painfully ignored by the main classic cars magazines that back then, and you could argue they're still a little bit, so they stay slightly snobbish about Ford brands. So we, for quite a long time, we just had the whole thing to ourselves, and so we just ran with it, and it was great. I loved it, and I did Classic Fords. So that was 98. So I did that for just under 4 years before eventually got the go ahead to do retro cars. But again, that was the sort of process of getting that off the ground was a really long gestation process, quite frustrating. But in the meantime, I was having the time of my life doing Classic Ford. It was brilliant. I loved it.
That's superb. It's good era to be involved in magazines in general, but car magazines, particularly if you've got that niche that you kind of own completely. That must have been more than a little bit pleasant to be involved in.
It was a strange time for magazines because the traditional car magazines, the tuning ones like Triple C, Cars and Car Conversions, I mean, they were. It's sad now, but they were dying because they just, they weren't keeping up with the times, and so Fast Car magazine had shifted its attention from tuning to, they started to embrace what became known as the Max Power scene. Obviously, Max Power came along in 1993. That turned that whole sector of the car magazine industry completely on its head, because the growth of those two at that point was just outrageous. And in a lot of ways, Classic Ford and Mini Magazine, all those single mark titles that were dealing with the slightly older cars, they were protected from that because, I mean, Max Power, Fast Car still was doing stuff with Mark 1 Escorts occasionally, Alba Revs, but really we were just left to just get along and do what we wanted with it. And so, yeah, it was great and it was really exciting, but also at that point, a big change. And compared to what happens, another sort of 6-7 years later, I mean, it seems insignificant now, but it was a big deal at the time.
Yeah, I think sort of as you're living through things, they probably felt a big deal, and then in retrospect, you're like, oh, in comparison to this, it's not so much. But then, at the time, I remember as a consumer, Max Power just suddenly being everywhere and in everything. So within the industry, it must have been even more obvious how big a title that became.
But it was just massive. I mean, it was beyond, a niche automotive interest. It was mainstream. You would, there were lads, because unfortunately it was, almost exclusively young males buying the magazine, but that's what it was at the time. They would be buying a magazine because they were buying into the lifestyle and the brand, not just because they were interested in, putting body kits on Renault 5 turbos or whatever. It was just, it just became something else.
So in 2003, it would have been the launch of Retro Cars magazine, but you would have been working on it for a while before that. So what is the germination of the Retro Cars magazine project? Like, how did that all start?
I'd grown up reading Custom Car, Street Machine, like a lot of people of my age, and as well as the more sort of hot roddy stuff, they would always do features on, humdrum cars that have been mucked around with, so Chevettes and Fiat 131s and things like that. And so, alongside Car and Car Conversions at that point. So, at that point in the late 90s, with Triple C sort of starting to fade away, there wasn't really anything around that was catering for those interests, because Street Machine and Custom Car were really digging in at that point to just focus on the custom car and hot rod scene. And I used to chat with people and say, I really miss, there's nothing around like this, especially a couple of friends, a photographer friend of mine, John Hill, who used to write for Street Machine, and also a guy called Chris Tilbury that at that point was editing Fast Forward magazine. And, we loved the Street Machine. Everyone's got their sort of favourite era of car magazines, but I think the late 80s, early 90s Street Machine, for me particularly, was the one that I was most influenced by. So there was, at that point, there was nothing around then. And when I used to go out on shoots and meet, readers for Classic Ford, quite often their mates would be there, and you say, oh, what do you drive then? And they say, oh, I've got an Avenger, or I've got a Mini or whatever, but I'm not interested in Mini magazine. I'm more interested in doing this and that. And so at that point, I thought, well, there'd be a market for this. And so I started sort of haranguing the publisher at the time, writing endless proposals, because he'd just fob me off saying, oh, I don't think it's right. Go and do some research. So I'd put together these massive dossiers of, slightly made up statistics and things. trying to find all these things that I could convince him. And eventually, after 18 months of badgering him, he eventually gave in and sort of gave me the tentative go-ahead to actually start doing some proper work on it. So this would have been maybe late 2001. And so I was still doing this whilst doing Classic Ford at the time. And we had to go up to the then magazine distributors to do a presentation about it. And they loved the idea, and they in hindsight, they probably got a bit too carried away with it because they thought it was going to be the next thing. And so they, all of a sudden, this sort of what I thought would be a fairly low key launch that we would then build up like we did with Classic Ford just became this huge sort of big deal that, quite honestly was probably never going to live up to their expectations in terms of circulation. But by then it was too late. The ball had started rolling, so we just had to run with it. So yeah, I finished working on Classic Ford full time at the end of 2002, and then I had just under 5 months to get the first issue of Retro Cars out the door, which sounds like a long time, but magazine launches the workload is just unbelievable. And it was a really intensive and stressful 5 months, to put it mildly.
That's the thing, you're going from absolutely nothing to defining your entire magazine really in your first issue. So how did you approach that? So how did you decide what was going to be in it, and kind of, you are pulling something out of nowhere. So you've effectively got your research that you've done and the sign off from the publisher. So they're expecting whatever it is you've sold them to expect. But in your head, did you know kind of what a first issue would contain, or were you like building it up in those 5 months to go, this is what it's actually going to be when we get to the pen to paper?
Yeah, I mean, I would have had, it's hard to remember now, but I would have had the whole magazine flat planned in my head. I could have just, splurged it out as to my sort of dream first issue. And that probably would have been very slowly eroded away as the sort of reality of doing it came to fruition. I mean, I was lucky in a way in that I knew exactly where to start because I had the contacts. I knew you had the cars, and how to get everything together. So I wasn't going in completely blind, but I knew it had to focus on a particular sort of era of cars and tuning, because that was where the biggest interest lay and where no one else was really doing much about at that point. And so it was really just trying to, with that first issue, like you said, just trying to encapsulate the whole idea behind it in one issue and try and convince people that although we weren't going to be able to do that in subsequent issues in such a way, it was strong enough to sort of sow the seed so that we could take it and run with it. But yeah, it was taking all sort of everyone's favorite sort of what you might call humdrum cars back then of the 60s, 70s and 80s, and just, channeling people's ideas about what you can do to them and mucking around with them and putting it into print.
Yeah, it was interesting. I've occasionally, as Retro Cars over the years that it existed, changed editors a few times. A couple of those editors will attest to the fact that I would occasionally send them the first 5 issues of the magazine to remind them of what it's supposed to be like. So well done on that.
Yeah, I know we've talked about this before, but I mean, the magazine had to change, and
oh yeah, for sure.
I mean, I did it for a year, and I was burnt out. I couldn't do it anymore because it would just completely destroy me. And I at that point we just had our first child, and I was just exhausted, and I couldn't keep it up. And I knew that it needed someone else to come in and sort of move it off to the next level. So yeah, I mean, I guess when we started it, I kind of planned out the first year's worth of issues and what I wanted to do and the different themes, and I more or less managed to stick to that. And so I probably content-wise, probably put too much stuff in those first issues, because I think after that, although you don't run out of ideas, you end up repeating yourself to a certain extent. So if I'd have thought about it with a bit more longer term planning in mind, I wouldn't have done so much, I think, because it was just ridiculous. If you look back now at the breadth of the content and the stuff, it's just, oh my god. Can you really do that? But it was great fun. Again, I say this a lot, but as much as you love the cars, the people are what make it. And I met so many interesting people in that period that I'm still in touch with now, and helped shape everything I've done since. So it was a really good experience from that front.
Yeah, I didn't realise until we did the podcast with Bryn, Bryn Musselwhite. Go back and check it; it's one of the early ones. That he wasn't involved in it, like right from the what's the word, concept stage. Like he came in and did the A to Z of retro, but I figured doing the A to Z of retro, he must have been involved with it for longer than he was. So that was an interesting thing to find out, that you'd got this band of people that kind of got the whole thing that you were giving a name to finally. So that was an interesting thing, that there were people out there kind of poised and ready in this world that didn't really yet exist, and you are now defining. That was good.
Yeah, I mean, I felt bad at the time because I didn't talk to Bryn about the magazine until probably just before it was announced it was going to be launched. And the reason behind that was because, as I alluded to before, the distributors they got so behind it that they really, there was a lot of money at stake basically in the launch, and so we had to be really quiet and careful about who we talked to it about. And because Bryn is so well connected, he knows a lot of people. He had a lot of friends that ended up working at EMAP on Max Power and Practical Classics and that. And so as much as I wanted to, I wasn't able to chat to him about the magazine because I didn't want to make him accidentally slip some info that would then might harm the initial launch. So it was a strange time in that respect, because all you want to do when you've got an idea is share it with people and say,
tell me about it.
Especially someone like Bryn, who will then go off on a complete different tangent and open up another door for you that you hadn't thought of. So I'm sorry, Bryn, but
no, it was more that from my point of view, that there were people kind of poised, ready for this world to exist, but you were busy kind of defining it, and then you were like, this now exists, and they could just dive into this kind of already half-filled swimming pool of car goodness, to make a very strange analogy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I mean, as soon as it was public, I was straight on to Bryn saying, "Oh, I'm doing this, blah, 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 blah. What about this? What about that?" And I mean, him at the time was great in introducing to me to people in the air-cooled Volkswagen scene, particularly. That was a big help. And obviously, he ended up writing and later photographing some fairly memorable shoots on those early issues.
Yeah, it was good to, and obviously with John Hill as well, who I think shot one of my features for you at some point, although that might have been a Classic Ford thing. Anyway, but yes, it was. It defined kind of what we did. So then you did the show. So this was one thing actually I have a curious thing about. So ANS Publishing in the UK is the same as ANS Publishing in Sweden. Am I right in thinking that? I mean,
it was two guys that started it, Albison and Schoberger, I think were their original names. And technically the company in Sweden was called Fabas. I can't remember what that stood for. And so they were the parent company. And then the UK, they had a stake in the UK version. But my understanding at the time is that the then MD of the UK operation, a guy called Peter Minnis, he had the controlling stake. But I mean, it was because it was a privately owned company, you didn't really know what was going on. But Yeah, but
It's
I
just,
mean, they,
it's just there is a retro cars magazine in Sweden, and I wondered whether or not it was related or not, because it's published by ANS Publishing out there.
I didn't know that. I mean, that's quite likely. I mean, back then their main title was a magazine called Bill Sport, which was kind of a cross
Yeah.
between Auto Sport and Triple C. So
Yeah, it is actually called Bill Sport Retro Car. When you see it, I've got a copy around here somewhere. If this was a video, I could show you, but it's not. So there we are. But yeah, I always wondered about the connection between those two things, and which came first. And I'm assuming from the sound of it, you came first as a big launch, and then they're like, right, we'll try this in Sweden, because obviously Sweden has a fairly strong retro car scene, so that's pretty sweet.
yeah, I mean the guys on the editorial staff at Fabas then, they were really good help in. They unlocked a few doors in when we were starting to go down the road of featuring some of the gap build cars. So yeah, they were really helpful. And I mean it's, you can get cynical about it, but basically people that work on car magazines are just enthusiasts. I mean, it's not a very well paid profession, and so you do it for the love. And generally, there's a reason why they're doing this, and it's because they're obsessed with the car. So wherever you are in the world, whether it's a magazine or a blog or a website, whatever, it's all, it's the same thing. It's this ridiculous obsession with cars. And
Yep. I know that story.
Of you older cars that have been mucked about with.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think everyone's doing it for the passion at this point. You just said you kind of burnt out from doing the retro cars thing, and then you went back to classic Ford. Was that just because it was a slightly easier time whilst you were raising newborns and such like?
No, I actually did fast forward after.
Oh, you did fast forward.
I
do apologize.
Yeah, there was at that point it didn't have an editor. The editor had left, Christian, and they hadn't appointed anyone else, and so I kind of I didn't go begging, but I almost went to the MD and said, look, I've got to go and do something else because I'm falling to bits, and can I? And we sort of agreed that I would take up fast forward. And although in a lot of ways, it was again something I'd not done before. I did that for about 3 years, but that was again, I just learned an incredible amount in that period because I'd grown up in an era where talking carburetors and traditional ignition systems, and to move from that into sort of more modern technology where you're talking ECUs and wastegates and control valves, and yeah, it was a real learning process, but I loved it. And again, it sent me off on lots of other different directions, and again, that was an interesting time because the magazines then were starting to move away from, with the more modern cars, were moving away from what we now call the max power era. That was starting to wind down, and the cars were becoming much more performance focused again and more sort of track focused. And so I sort of had this unwritten task of taking fast forward away from being body kits and back to being tuning and performance and speed. So yeah, it was great. I loved it.
Yeah, no, I completely blanked that era, but that was when Future purchased ANS. Am I right in thinking that that was where you were when over that transition? Yeah, I'm trying to remember what you were editing when I was meeting you for lunch in Bath.
Yeah, that was so I was doing fast forward in 2004, and then Future bought out ANS Publishing, the UK side certainly, in 2005, and so yeah, the ones they kept on, we were all shipped off down to Bath to go and work for the next sort of 9 years. And that was an eye-opener because I'd gone from having one boss to countless bosses. And that was, again, a steep learning curve, being sort of taken into this huge media organisation at that point that did things in a very different way. But you learn to adapt and find ways of doing what you did before, but just slightly differently. And I mean, they were. I mean, at that point, I had a really good publisher called Pete Stothard, who was really supportive, and he helped us get stuff done. He found money to buy project cars. He got loads of things done. It was brilliant, really good.
Yeah, it was sort of kind of the, I guess, a last hurrah of the magazine industry, but it was the point at which it was still pushing forward regardless. And maybe it shouldn't have been. Maybe it should have been, it had slightly more than one eye on what was happening on the World Wide Web and stuff like that at the time. But it seemed like a good time for magazines. Like the articles that were getting written clearly had budget behind them, and the magazines were, I don't know, everything was kind of had a confidence to it, which I quite liked. And then the events as well. I mean, your events team were based down in Bath, and the events seemed to be growing from both retro cars point of view and sort of everything else. It seemed to all be coming together at Future, and then Future did what Future does and started to fold up, I'm guessing. But I'm going to just take a slight step back before we get into the murky world of magazines and what the hell happened to them, and get into the world of what the hell does an editor actually do on a day-to-day basis?
You're to use the I mean, it's such a overused phrase, but you're the jack of all trades and master at none. You just have to do everything, particularly now. So it depends on the sort of the production cycle of we have a sort of 3 or 4 week production cycle at the moment on Classic 4, but it depends where you are with that. But generally, your day involves around commissioning photo shoots, attending photo shoots, writing up features, doing interviews, especially over the phone these days, speaking to advertisers, speaking to readers, speaking to potential advertisers, writing endless reports and emails, doing a ridiculous amount of promotion of the magazines through social media and through the other sort of online platforms. Doing forward planning, so you're trying to sort of plan issues that might be going on in sort of 6 to 8 months time, particularly ones where they've been promoted, so they have additional spend on them in the newsagents and the supermarkets where they're getting a different position on the newsagent, on the actual racking, so you have to do something special for those. I mean, it just rolls on, but it's great because it means you don't do the same thing every time. You're always doing something differently.
Yeah, each issue is a new issue, which is more than most people have.
Yeah.
Like most other people seem to do the same thing every day.
Your sort of dream is to sort of every new issue, you want to make it better than the last one, and you also want to make it something different as well. And I mean, people do that in different ways, but the worst thing is to try and just retread what you were doing before, but you kind of are in a way. You just have to look at it, you try and take it on from a different angle so that you're sort of keeping traditional longer term readers still interested, but also at the same time hopefully trying to bring in new readers as well.
Yeah, I guess it's a case of gradual, slow evolution rather than revolution if you want to change something about a magazine.
I think it's difficult. I mean, because the way the publishing industry is now, I think it's really difficult to revolutionise the magazine. I think there's too much at stake now. They can't take those kind of risks. So you could do a new launch of something, but I think to actually revolutionise an existing brand or existing title now is probably I can't think of more than a few examples off the top of my head where publishers do that. I mean, it's you're much more aware of your readership and the marketplace than you were back then. So as sad as it sounds, there is a lot less risk taking now, I think.
Yeah, which is interesting, given that possibly more risk taking may be beneficial, but then it's too big a risk, I guess, because you're no longer betting, perhaps a couple of months of poor distribution, and then it'll pick back up again. You're literally betting the life of a magazine on whatever it is you're doing.
Yeah, but there are different opportunities. So I mean, you and I talked about this, but obviously, I mean, the independent magazine sector is a whole different ball game, and so where it's it's not your livelihood at stake, you can take risks and try something different. And I think that's where, certainly for a lot of people, that is where there are opportunities to try different things and try and sort of do something that fires up people's imagination in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, I've got on my list of things here to talk about the current state of magazines, but I was going to leave it towards the end. But I think this sounds like an ideal time to dive into it. So the market's kind of strange at the moment in comparison to what it once was. There's still an awful lot of quality writers and photographers and editors out there producing really good magazines for an audience that loves them. But also at the same time, there's kind of a vanishing amount of magazines, which is odd and interesting in equal measure, and saddening to a certain degree, that magazines are getting shuttered when there's still an audience for them. It's just not the audience that there once was. But at the same time, on the flip side, there's all these independent magazines, and I mean, we failed to launch one, but we attempted to launch one at probably the worst time we could have launched one. It's a thing that people are doing. They are launching new magazines with new ideas and seeing what flies. So how are you feeling about kind of the whole magazine industry, rather than sort of the non-independent magazine industry, which does seem to struggle a bit, even though it's keeping going?
At the moment, because of the what's been happening over the months, I mean, it's been pretty dire. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of the big publishers have had to close some titles that were at risk, and because of the declining economy, that's sort of tipped them into making the decision that we just can't justify doing this anymore. So unfortunately, it's not just the automotive sector; it's across all the board that they've had to close titles, which is really sad. But at the same time, there are people bubbling away with ideas and the means to do it that will start something new. And so I'm hoping that there are lots of positives that come out of all of this, and actually it does give people the impetus to say, well, I'm just going to get on with this and do it now. And so the strongest titles in publishing will continue and will survive. There will be new stuff to come out, I'm sure of it.
Yeah, I was thinking on this the other day that this whole not quite a perfect match, but it's books versus cinema versus plays, and it also like the whole vinyl versus CDs, etc. In that a new thing comes along and it just takes the entire market with it. So when the silent movies and the talkies then followed, they took away from plays and theatre. But then if you look at what plays and what the theatre is doing now, it's really healthy. And in fact, in some ways, the movie industry has fed back into it, and its actors have gone back to the theatre, and there's like a certain level of quality about it. But also there's a certain level of being able to enter it very cheaply, in that you can go and join your local amateur dramatic society, and you can't necessarily make your own feature film. And I think that the magazine market hasn't quite got to that point, but it's getting there. Like we've had the era of zines and things like that, particularly in the music industry, as you're very, very well aware of, and like this sort of homespun publishing, and the internet and the World Wide Web became that for a while, and then Facebook and Instagram and stuff have come along and eaten that as well. So that's kind of disappeared, and these people still want an outlet, and Facebook and Instagram is not the outlet for that stuff. And I think that the independent publishing and the accessibility of independent publishing is going to be that. And I think you're right that there's going to be a fallout of people from the current magazine industry that's having a shrinkage at the moment, and the group of very enthusiastic people that want to get their voice out there, and they're going to collide in the not too distant future. And there, I think, will be a kind of weird resurgence in the printed product. It just won't be the same as it once was. It'll have to be something different. It'll have to be structured somewhat differently. That's my thought on it. And podcast listeners will know that I'm always right.
I mean, the independent magazine industry is, I mean, it's the last sort of 5-6 years, it's had a definite resurgence, because there are various platforms that have made it easy to put magazines out there, and so there's a huge support network. And from the automotive side, that's not really happened. I mean, there are some really good ones now, but we're only sort of talking in the last sort of 12 to 18 months. And so for car magazines, I think it will be some good one on stream soon that people will get really excited about, because the network, the facilities to actually do them now is all there, so that if you haven't come from that publishing background, the tools are there to help you to actually do it if that's what you want to do. And if you can get that passion down properly onto something printed that people think is desirable and want to engage with, then yeah, it's a no-brainer.
Yeah, I think the business models around all these things are changing as well. I mean, I've noticed it even from a website point of view that we get blamed to a certain degree for killing the magazine industry, and it's a reasonable complaint, I guess, but we didn't do it on our own. But I also think that in turn, like the website lunch has been eaten by other media as well, like on the internet still, but then YouTube has come along, and suddenly the democratization of being able to film and do that just on your phone or with relatively cheap stuff, suddenly everyone's got their own TV show, and it's sort of that's kind of come back around that there's a bit more of a democracy in terms of who gets to film car stuff now, and there isn't so much gatekeeping as there once was, because it used to just be Top Gear or whatever special DVD was being made by Option or someone like that. So yeah, the industry itself, from my point of view, it's sort of a relative insider/outsider. I think it has a healthy future, but I think it's got a period of time, particularly with this COVID stuff, of going to be a difficult period. But I think it will be transitioning into something hopefully relatively healthy. It just has a slight period of adjustment, one would say.
Yeah, I mean, all industries are going through that at the moment. I mean, I mean, every time there's a new sort of technology or platform that comes along, it's an opportunity, and it's just another way of getting your passion and your enthusiasm out there. So I'm not blinkered by any means. I sort of try and embrace all of it, and I think that there's room for everything. Basically, it's just making sure whether the main medium you focus on, whether it's YouTube or it's print, you're just trying to do the very best you can in that particular aspect to bring people in, and you use the other platforms to help draw them in as well.
Yeah, definitely. So, and this is going to be a question that's true across all of these platforms. For you, what makes a good feature car? When you get sent lots of cars, I should imagine, or people proposing features, what makes you go, this is the one I want to feature?
It's quite often it's nothing to do with the actual car itself. It's the story behind it. So if there's no story behind a car, it quite often it just turns people cold, because it may look amazing, but if the guy that built it just did it on a whim, there's no story, or he paid someone else, or he or she paid someone else to do it, and the guy that did it just did it because that's what they were told to do, that makes it really difficult to then try and pass on that sort of passion to your audience. So it almost doesn't matter what the car is, it's the story behind it. And yes, there are sort of, there are cars out there that everyone remembers for being outlandish or game changing, but quite often when you actually start digging down into why, it's because the person or people that built it had a particular vision and the passion to see it through. So that's my argument. But I mean, that you can build a car that will go down a storm on Instagram, but the next day there'll be something else to replace it. It's the ones that people remember. That's the ones you're always running after and trying to chase. Say, please, we want to capture what you've created in print or online or wherever. But that's the mission.
Yeah, that's good. And when you're putting together your magazine, how do you decide what's going to be the cover card? Do you decide that kind of before the whole thing's together, like this car that you're going to get featured, that's got to be the cover car, or do you go through the photos and go, oh, that's a very compelling picture, I'm going to stick that on?
Quite often, everyone works differently, but certainly with Classic Ford, the cars that are on the cover have been specifically, and we generally will try and theme an issue. So we don't just put an issue out there. Generally, it's got a theme behind it, whether it's a particular tuning angle, or there's an anniversary, or we're focusing on a particular genre, like resto mod, for example. I mean, talking to Callum at Retro Power recently, in one of your other podcasts. So we'll pick a theme and then run with that for that issue, and then so the cover car has to kind of encapsulate whatever that theme's about. And occasionally we'll do we'll actually do a specific group shot that sums that up, or it may be more of a collage style cover. But it's very rarely now would we shoot a car for the cover just to put that on the cover. It has to back everything else up that's inside it as well.
I mean, it's a complete package at that point, I'm guessing. So that makes it all make sense.
People, I don't believe people would generally now would pick up and pay for a magazine just because of one feature car in it. I think, it's so much harder to get them to spend their money with you now because everything's available for free online. So even if you've got a feature on a car that hasn't yet broken onto the internet, so you've got an exclusive on it, really that car has to sell the rest of the issue. So you're not just going off the fact that there's one car on there that you like the look of. You're actually buying the whole magazine because you think, well, actually, I want to read about this. I want to learn about that. I want to know how to do this. That's the goal of it, really.
Do you well, actually, I was about to put words in your mouth. What do print magazines offer over and above Instagram or sort of blog features on cars from your point of view?
You can go into so much more detail. You can put together a more rounded story, because I mean I write for Speed Hunters, and I really enjoy writing feature cars and stories for them because it's completely different to write for a magazine. You're almost writing a story based around images rather than actually trying to thread a story together, but based around images. Whereas when you write a feature for a magazine, you're actually creating a story that then flows through the images on the page. But because of that, you can create and construct a whole different world that draws people in a much more involved way. And through the use of things like box outs and additional features, you create this, I'm using this word too much, but you're creating a world that people get drawn into and lose themselves in. And it's much more engaging, I think, than engaging with a blog post. And it's just a different way of doing it. It's not necessarily better or worse, but the brain just doesn't cope well with just doing one thing all the time. You don't look at Instagram and not look at anything else. You look at everything now, don't you? So yeah, we're just one facet of it. But you've got the added pressure of actually, well, look, we want you to pay for this magazine, whether it's a subscription or you just picked it up off the shelf in a newsagent. So in a way, you've got a harder job, but that's the challenge.
I think the challenge is there, but what you're saying, if someone is paying for this, then you are offering more in-depth information than they're going to get elsewhere. I used to get quite frustrated with reading features that were effectively just the specs of the car, just kind of reprinted over 1,500 words. Whereas more often than not, you would get features that would drag you in, as you say, to why someone built it or what it was about a car that attracted them to it, and that in turn would bring you in as well. And I from a retro point of view, that I thought was quite important. I should imagine it's true also within the classic Ford world. But from the retro point of view, I found that I was looking at cars that I had no personal attachment to until I read the article, and by the end of the article, I wanted it. And I think that's the magic trick that you don't necessarily get from someone posting up their own build thread and as you say, the image led blog articles. It's like, look at this thing, you look at it and you go, that's very nice, and you carry on. Whereas I think with the magazine stuff, to use your word, they do drag you into the world of that car, whether or not that's a single mark magazine or multi-mark like Retro Cars was.
Yeah, absolutely. And it again goes right back to what I was saying about it has to have a good story behind it. Yeah, I mean, if you, I'm sure I've been guilty of doing this before with putting features in Classic Ford that maybe would have been glorified tech specs. But I sure as hell would go out my way not to do that now, because you are so painfully aware of that.
Yeah. I mean, it's not a thing against that. Like that's kind of, you sometimes you have to write a feature, and actually the only interesting thing about the car is the tech, which is why, as you say, you try and pursue the personal story and the reasonings behind it. So it wasn't sort of a dig at that, but it was more, I found the ones that did have a story that dragged me into why someone had a car. It was, it kind of influenced my choices on what cars I wanted and all that kind of thing, which I think is the power of the magazine in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the one that always jumps out, or the one I remember more than anything, a couple of years ago, we did a feature on a guy called Paul Owens that created a replica of Roger Clark's RAC winning Escort, the Cossack car. Do you remember the Cossack hairspray for men livery?
Yeah.
And it could have just been, oh, that's a really nice replica, but actually, very early in the sort of process of arranging a feature with him, he produced this photo of him as a 10-year-old stood by the door of the car with Royal Clark in it, and he met him, and that just sort of sowed this whole seed to create this amazing. And so all of a sudden, as a reader, you're like, you can just see where it's come from. And that story was a gift for us because Roger Clark was, to many people, is still such a huge rallying hero, but also because, the guy fulfilled his dream of building this car that he'd first seen, 30 years ago.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's an amazing achievement to have a dream and fully realize it. I'm going to. Oh, actually, I forgot to ask you this earlier. What are you currently driving? What is your current interest in cars, if you have any? I know times can be tough for the car enthusiast at the moment.
My so down in my lockup, I've got a really early Martin Cortina, a 1963 Deluxe, which at the moment is untouched. That's not deliberate. It's just at time. I've got this. I'm not the only one that has this. I hasten to add, but I've got this annoying obsession with first-year builds of cars. So it probably doesn't happen as much now, but certainly in the 60s and 70s, that when a new car came out, they hadn't quite worked things out properly, and so you'll find that the very first sort of few months or even a year of build, the cars are slightly different to what followed after, as they sort of work through things that didn't quite work. And so there'll be tiny little details that you won't find on later models, and most people wouldn't notice them because the cars, being the earliest, they very rarely survive now. They're usually the first ones to disappear. So I've always had this annoying fascination for. It just goes back to when I had minis. I mean, the very early minis, they said they used to press the shells out of lighter steel. So all the racers back then used to try and hunt down these 59 build minis because they were meant to be lighter. And there were loads of little different details on them, like the door handles or the seals and things. So that sort of followed through to the cars I've had since. So this Cortina is one of the first year builds. So it's got lots of different details onto some of the later cars. And so I get a bit too excited about things like that, I'm afraid. But at some point in the future, when I've got a bit of time, I'll actually start to not rip into this. That's the wrong word, but go through it and put it back on the road as my sort of the how I can see it in my head.
That's great. That's I'm looking forward to seeing that. So I got a couple of I always think of them as emergency questions in case conversation starts to falter, but they always end up just being thrown in at the end because there's always something to talk about with car people. But I do like them as questions, so I'm going to ask you a couple. What's the fastest you've been in a car?
Yeah, so this going back to retro cars, we did a group feature on, I can't remember the feature angle, but it would have been something like historic race cars, and this is at Bruntingthorpe Proving Ground, which is, if people aren't aware, it's an old World War II airfield that is now used for testing, and then so they've got a 2-mile long straight, and it back then when we had a bit more money, and it wasn't actually expensive to hire, you could hire part of the runway, and it was really good for getting group shots of cars because they had so much room. Anyway, I apologise to the guy because I've forgotten his name, but the guy took me out he had a TR7 V8 race car, and we went up the airfield in it and went flat out, and obviously there's no speedometer, but anyway, it just felt completely natural. I didn't think we were going that fast. And when we got back, and I said, "Oh, how fast do you think we were going?" He said, "Well, it's been timed at 175." So that's the fastest I've been in a car, not driving, thankfully. But it just felt, it was bizarre. It just felt completely relaxed, and I was chatting away with him, and he wasn't having to concentrate particularly. But yeah, I don't think I've told my family that before, so hopefully they don't listen.
That's superb. What's your favourite car you've had the chance to drive?
Ooh, I very rarely drive other people's cars because even if they say we like to have a go, I'll always try and decide, because if someone spent the best decade and a huge part of their lives building something, they really don't want some idiot getting in it and writing it off. So I tell you what, I really enjoyed driving. Back in the early 2000s, before retro cars, we bought a Capri 2.8 engine, and I'd never driven one before, and we turned it into a track day car because that was the rage back then. And it was quite cheap to do. I mean, the car cost 600 quid. I think we built it for, in the end, just under £2,000. But even though it was a dedicated track car, it was so nice to drive. And I had any excuse, I would get in it and just go off somewhere because it was just lovely, really nice. And it had no interior. It was all stripped out with a roll cage, bucket seats, and it could have been horrendous, but it was just, I loved it. And I've never managed to recreate how well that car drove in anything I've owned since, and that today annoys me. It wasn't a magic trick. It was just one of those cars that was just sorted with minimal work, and it was brilliant. It was so lovely to drive. And yeah, we would drive all over the country in it, go and do a track day, sort of run around in that, and then drive home again as if we hadn't been anywhere. It was brilliant. I loved it. And the car is still around. It sort of surfaces now and again, which is really good to know. That's so yeah, good. That's if I could recreate that now, that'd be perfect.
Maybe the Cortina is that car.
Well, I don't think. I mean, again, a 60s Cortina drives way better than you think it should. If you've never driven one before, you'd be amazed, but it's completely different to driving a late 70s Capri. That even then the difference is immeasurable.
That's good old cars. Well, thank you very much, Simon, for your time this morning.
No, thank you.
I will happily talk to you whenever about anything, because I always enjoy talking to you. So you're still on Classic Ford, so people should definitely go and support Classic Ford as when you can, because we're allowed out of the house now, so you can go and do those things. Yes, thank you for your time.
No, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
We'll be back next time. Now, I've got 2 lined up, and I don't know who's going to be first, so I'm not going to say. It'll be a surprise. There you go.